Good morning, everyone. My name's Rick Brown, and I'm Deputy Director at the Australian Institute of Criminology. And welcome to our latest occasional seminar entitled Preventing Intimate Partner Homicide in Australia, Opportunities for Stopping and Disrupting IPH Trajectories. Before we begin, myself and my panelists would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting across the country today, and to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us here today. And welcome to everyone here for this presentation. Now, I just want to start with some admin. First, can I first of all ask that you don't take any screenshots or any recordings of the seminar this morning. We will be recording the event, and we'll make sure that you get access to that recording. So for any of those registered, you can get access to this in the next week or so. There will be an opportunity for a Q&A session at the end of the seminar. So do type your questions into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll get to those towards the end of the presentation. Finally, it's important to recognise this is a sensitive topic for everybody, and we just want to make sure you take care of yourselves. So if there's anything that's discussed today that raises any strong feelings or concerns, do reach out for support. And we're going to make available some contact details for organisations in the Q&A box. So do go to the Q&A if you'd like to make those links. Now, when a woman and her children are murdered by a current or former intimate partner, as a community, we usually feel surprise and condemnation at the offender. And we also wonder what we could do differently as loved ones, as a community, as practitioners, as policymakers and researchers, to prevent such horrendous events from happening again in future. And that's really the focus of today, for identifying those opportunities to prevent intimate partner homicide in Australia. And it's really our belief in this presentation that that prevention is possible. Now, we'll be taking a look from a life course lens, which we think is a really important approach to view intimate partner homicide from. This means that we need to look at every stage in an offender's pathway or trajectory to the point where they've committed a homicide, and that includes looking at points through childhood right up to the weeks and days prior to an event occurring, to look at those opportunities for prevention where these kinds of events could have been stopped. Now, myself and the panelists that are looking at this from a life course perspective are in no way excusing or reducing the accountability of men who commit these kinds of crimes. Rather, we're focused purely on preventing the serious harms that are caused or that befall women and their children in these kinds of events. Really, we're focused on how we can reduce the burden on women to keep themselves safe, and looking at those points by looking at those points of intervention. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Hayley Boxall, who will now introduce our first presentation. Over to you, Hayley.
Thanks, Rick. Hi, everyone. My name is Hayley, and I manage the Violence Against Women and Children Research Program here at the AIC, and I will be facilitating this seminar. The first presentation will be given by Dr. Samantha Bricknell. Sam is a research manager at the AIC. She oversees the AIC statistical collections, including the National Homicide Monitoring Program, National Deaths in Custody Program, and the forthcoming Australian Sexual Offences Statistical Collection, as well as the Indigenous Justice Research Program. Sam has over 15 years of research experience in the areas of homicide, deaths in custody, human trafficking and slavery, family and domestic violence, illicit firearms, and environmental crime. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Hayley, and thank you for the invitation to present at today's very important forum. As Hayley mentioned, I am a research manager at the AIC, and one of my responsibilities is the National Homicide Monitoring Program. And the NHMP was established at the AIC back in 1990 and has played a key role in understanding the prevalence of homicide in Australia, that being murder and manslaughter, in particular the prevalence of domestic homicide and specifically intimate partner homicide. All of you will be familiar with the 1 woman killed each week by an intimate partner statistic, which emanated from the NHMP. Intimate partner homicide is the most prevalent form of homicide in Australia, and that statistic has not improved in the interim, with currently 1 woman killed by an intimate partner every 10 days in Australia. We know that over 1,550 females were killed by a current or former intimate partner in the 31 years since 1989-90. In that time, between 33 and 73 girls and women aged between 14 and 94 have been killed each year by their intimate partner. What we've also seen, though, is a decrease in the numbers of intimate partner homicide victims. This decrease parallels a general decrease in female homicide victimisation, or there has been a little bit of an uptick in recent years, and overall homicide victimisation in Australia. And as you can see for the figure up on the page, the rate of intimate partner homicide victimisation has dropped from a high of 1.1 per 100,000 in 1990-91 to 0.35 or less per 100,000 in the last 3 years from 2017-18. Now, the reasons for this decline are still to be thoroughly explored in Australia. There has been some international literature looking at what's been occurring in the US and what have you, but this is further work for Australia to understand why these rates have gone down. But while we are seeing a decrease in numbers of intimate partner homicide victims, there has actually been a small increase in the proportion of all victims that this group comprises. So in the 1990s, around 15% of all homicide victims were victims victims of interpartner, but this has actually risen, so the proportion of all homicide victims that we're seeing today is around 20%. So it's jumped up from 15% to 20% in that time period. So while we've had a decrease in rates and numbers, we've actually had an increase in the proportion of all victims that female intimate homicide victims represent. Intimate partner homicide victims comprise around half of all female victims of homicide. But what we can see is a particularly high prevalence among Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander girls and women. Around 2/3 of female Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander homicide victims were killed by a current or former intimate partner since 1989-90. And in over 90% of these incidents, the offender was also Indigenous. Among our non-Indigenous girls, female victims, just under half were killed by a current or former intimate partner. And this statistic talks to some of the reporting last week, particularly at the discussion around violence against women and children, about understanding what's happening amongst our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population and these very high prevalence rates of intimate partner homicide among them. My co-presenters will talk in more detail about intimate partner homicide offenders and some of the context in which intimate partner homicide is perpetrated. And these findings reflect some of the high-level findings that we have seen over the 31 years of the NHMP. So, for example, most women were in seemingly intact relationships at the time of the homicide, between 2/3 to 3/4 in any given year. But the circumstances of the relationships and the reality that some of them were actually in the process of separating at the time suggest conventional measures of around marital status, for example, require further passing. And some of that work will be addressed at today's forum. 1/5 of victims, excluding Indigenous victims, were born overseas, and this is actually a high proportion compared with other female homicide victims in Australia and other non-intimate partner victims, where it's just over 1/10. So while we aren't able to talk about the called circumstances of our victims within the NHMP, we can show that a much higher proportion of them were actually born overseas compared to other victims of homicide in Australia. The causes of death of female victims of intimate partner homicide largely reflect causes of death across all homicide victims, primarily sharp force injuries, followed by injuries as a result of beatings and gunshot wounds. Although there is a closer proportion in terms of gunshot wounds and beatings amongst female intimate partner homicides when you compare against other homicide victims. But there is one main difference, and this is not going to be a surprise to the audience today. Strangulation deaths among female victims of intimate partner homicide are double the rate that is determined for other victims of homicide, and that is excluding victims of filicide. Finally is the suicide rate amongst offenders. Most male intimate partner homicide offenders are 4 times as likely to die by suicide after the homicide compared to any other offender within a homicide offender within Australia. And almost all of these men die by suicide prior to arrest, a few subsequent after the arrest. And this really distinguishes this group of homicide offenders compared to other homicide offenders in Australia. And finally is to recognise the other victims of these homicides. Most homicides in Australia are single victim incidents, and almost all of intimate partner homicides are too. Yet there is a small proportion where other people are killed with the intimate partner. Some of these women were killed with their children or with other family members or both. Around 60% of co-victims were the victim and the offender's children, biological or stepchildren. A smaller number are killed with their current intimate partner, and in some incidents they were killed with someone who the offender was friends or acquainted with, or who they had never met before. And all these circumstances, these people were with the victim at the time of the homicide, and in some cases tried to intervene in terms of the homicide, and as a result lost their lives as well. We will be publishing new intimate partner homicide data over the next year, as well as looking at other family homicides. The NHMP was, of course, the key data source to the Pathways to Intimate Partner Homicide project, which my colleagues Hayley, Siobhan and Lawler undertook. I like to see the NHMP as both a foundational and complementary reservoir of information about intimate partner homicide. It provides key time series information to understand changes in homicide and complements the findings of death review teams, other official data such as the ABS Recorded Crime and Justice Recorded Crime Victims and Offenders series, and interviews, of course, with family, offenders and practitioners. It also promotes comprehensive examinations of intimate partner homicide, some of which will be presented today. Thank you for your time, and thank you again, Hayley, for the invitation to present today.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for providing that foundational research for us to kind of be thinking about in the back of our minds while we're getting into the other presentations. So next up, we have Dr. Siobhan Lawler. Siobhan is a senior research analyst in the Violence Against Women and Children research program here at the AIC. Prior to joining the AIC, Siobhan held research positions at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at the University of New South Wales and the Matilda Centre for Research and Mental Health and Substance Use at the University of Sydney. Her research areas of interest and expertise include violence prevention, alcohol and other drugs, sentencing and restorative justice. Thank you very much, Siobhan.
Thank you, Hayley, and thank you everyone for joining online today. So today I'll be talking to you about experiences of early adversity among male intimate partner homicide perpetrators. So I'll begin by talking about how a life course perspective is relevant and our research examining pathways to intimate partner homicide in Australia. I'll then provide an overview of experiences of trauma, abuse, alcohol and other drug problems, mental health and comorbidity among perpetrators in that research project, and discuss some of the implications of these findings for preventing intimate partner homicide. Now, when we're discussing mental health in the context of criminal behaviour, this inevitably leads to questions around culpability. And it's important that I just re-emphasise something here, something that Rick said at the beginning, that this is not an attempt to rationalise, pathologise or make excuses for these men. The aim here is to explore the interrelated risk factors for intimate partner homicide as they presented among the offenders in our study, such as adversity, recognising that we need to balance the need for offender accountability with the reality that many of these individuals suffered severe trauma and health conditions that negatively impacted on their capacity and their agency to varying degrees. So the life course perspective recognises the need for prevention and intervention at all ages, focusing both on the most vulnerable people as well as the population at large. So I'm going to start at the beginning of the life course, as I'm primarily talking about experiences during childhood and adolescence. There are many approaches to preventing violence and abuse. However, currently most of our responses to intimate partner violence are tertiary or reactive, such as the health system and the criminal justice system, and we could be focusing more on intervening during these early years to reduce intimate partner homicide. So as Sam said, the information that I'm presenting on today is taken from the Pathways into Intimate Partner Homicide project, which was an Anne Rose funded project undertaken by the Australian Institute of Criminology. which aim to describe the nature and course of intimate partner relationships that culminate in the male perpetrated homicide of a female partner, and to examine the combination and sequencing of characteristics, behaviours and events that precipitate the lethal incident. So 3 main data sources were used to address these aims. These included sentencing remarks from intimate partner homicide matters that were considered by the Supreme Court from each Australian state and territory. So these provide details of each judge's reasons for the sentence that they deliver. We also looked at coronial records from the National Coronial Information System and information from the National Homicide Monitoring Program, which also includes offence records obtained from each Australian state and territory police agency. Sampling was generally reflective of the Australian population distribution and proportionate to the number of incidents of intimate partner homicide in each jurisdiction and by the Indigenous status of the offender. Offenders and victims were around 40 years old at the time of the homicide. Over half were born in Australia, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were overrepresented both as victims and perpetrators of intimate partner homicide. Now, trauma is a word that does get thrown around a lot, as it's something that many people experience at some point in their lives. So trauma can be an event or an ongoing experience that a person may be unable to process, that interferes with coping and functioning, and that is usually a response to an experience which posed a significant threat to a person's life or well-being. People's reaction to potentially traumatic experiences varies. Most people will recover with support. Others may have a more severe response and more difficulty in their recovery, and they may develop mental health problems as a result, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and substance use problems, among others. In the Pathways into Intimate Partner Homicide project, in a minority of cases, offenders were reported to have experienced relatively ordinary upbringings. Sentencing judges used words like normal, uneventful, happy, and even loving to describe their family and background. However, it was more common, and in at least 1/3 of cases, offenders were described as having childhoods characterised by significant abuse and neglect. Rates of reported adverse childhood experiences were consistent with international estimates of childhood trauma among intimate partner homicide perpetrators. Changes in carer arrangements, such as being removed from the home, witnessing or being a target of family violence, and the death of family members were the most common traumas experienced during this time. Child abuse and neglect was defined as being a target of family violence, such as experiencing physical or sexual victimization, emotional abuse, witnessing intimate partner violence between carers, having changes in care arrangements, and suffering extreme socioeconomic deprivation. In most cases, the offender's biological father was the perpetrator of family violence in the home, usually against the offender, his mother, or female siblings. In a few cases, it was the mother or another family member like an aunt or uncle. Many offenders experienced emotional abuse and cruel treatment as a young person. For example, in one case, an offender's father was described as subjecting him to social humiliation on a regular basis, whereas others had fathers that were described as cold and dismissive. Abuse that came from the mother was usually framed in the context of mental health problems and property damage. And offenders often experienced multiple forms of abuse, such as both physical and emotional abuse at home. Sexual assault victimisation was only reported in a few cases. In one case, the offender was raped by an adult stranger, and in another case by his brothers. So in line with what we know about reporting of sexual assault, this is very likely a vast underrepresentation, so we don't really know. The experience of being removed from home can be a traumatic experience in its own right, compounding the adversity that leads a person there in the first place. So of the 15% of offenders that were removed from home as a child or adolescent and placed in alternative care arrangements, half went to live with family and half went to live with non-family members and settings such as refuges, foster homes, orphanages and group homes. And this was more common for Aboriginal offenders. We also see these experiences intersecting frequently. For example, in one case, the offender was removed from home when he was 3, and then he returned at the age of 7. So while he was in out-of-home care, his parents had divorced, and his mother had remarried a member of a motorcycle gang. His home life was characterised by dysfunction and heavy alcohol use, and he eventually dropped out of school in Year 9. The deaths of family members during childhood and adolescence was experienced by 1 in 6 offenders, and this was typically a primary caregiver or a sibling, and the death was often sudden, resulting from accidents, suicide, or drug overdoses. Now, this theme is consistent with research that the unexpected death of a loved one is the worst of all traumas, regardless of other forms of trauma that someone has experienced. The grief associated with the loss of close relationships in childhood and adolescence was described by judges as having a significant negative impact on the offender and their trajectory. For example, in one case, an offender went to live with his grandmother when he was 9 months old and was very close to her growing up. She died when he was 13, and after this, he did not have a stable place to live. He was then exposed to significant violence and alcohol use in the community, his behaviour deteriorated, and he started offending and using inhalants, alcohol, and cannabis. Of course, grief is something that we all experience at some point, but it's important to recognise the role of grief and loss associated with trauma in order to provide support to people in their recovery and in their rehabilitation, as the period right after someone experiences a significant and unexpected loss is a critical time for the development of mental health and substance use problems. So it's clear that the early years of life are important for healthy development. Many traits and behaviours are moulded during this time, and we see differences emerging even in very young children. These can become stable across the life course. Of course, most who experience trauma do not go on to use violence, but most of those who use violence have experienced cumulative adverse childhood experiences. The link between family violence victimisation and later adult family violence offending has often been explained by social learning theory, that children learn early on that violence is an acceptable and appropriate means of communicating and resolving conflict, and they bring this belief with them into adulthood. Links between early adversity, abuse, and neglect by parents may also be explained by attachment theory, where adverse childhood experiences can have a negative impact on a person's attachment to their primary carers, which then influences subsequent attachment to intimate partners and others later on. So this may present with a person being overly avoidant, cold or withholding toward their partner, or overly attached and anxious about being abandoned. At either extreme, violence may be used as a way to manage emotional distress. In the Pathway study, experiences of trauma and abuse was frequently related to the high rates of mental health and physical health problems across the sample. 1 in 5 offenders had a long-term health condition or a cognitive impairment, frequently an acquired brain injury or chronic pain issues. Just over half had a drug and alcohol use problem, and just under half had a mental illness of some nature. Comorbidity between physical health, mental health, and substance use was reported by nearly half of intimate partner homicide offenders. Because of the nature of the data, this was defined as having experienced 2 or more serious health conditions during their lifetime. So this supports past research showing that people with co-occurring alcohol and other drug problems and mental illness are at higher risk of committing homicide than people that do not have these problems. When we look at the types of problems perpetrators experience together, most commonly we see mental illness and alcohol and other drug going hand in hand for this group, which is expected. Some patterns in comorbidities were observed, so the majority of those with post-traumatic stress disorder and personality disorders also had substance use problems, which is also consistent with research showing that these combinations specifically signal a high risk of intimate partner violence and violence more generally. Among those with reported long-term health conditions and cognitive disabilities, again, we see mental illness and alcohol and other drug problems being the key comorbidities. So an example of this that came up multiple times was where an offender had to stop working due to a long-term health problem or injury. They then became depressed about this loss of agency and started drinking heavily to self-medicate their distress, which then contributed to their depression worsening and to a cycle of deterioration overall. Now, what we see from our research and what I've talked about today is that many intimate partner homicide offenders actually have very similar histories to others who perpetrate violence and become engaged with the criminal justice system. We know trauma is linked to violence and criminal justice trajectories, regardless of intimate partner homicide risk. So interventions that aim to prevent violence and criminal justice trajectories more generally may have an impact on trajectories towards intimate partner homicide. A good resource for getting an overview of international evidence in the prevention of violence across different settings is the 2020 review by the Violence Research Centre at the Cambridge Institute of Criminology, and the link to this will be put into the chat. It provides an overview of 26 different prevention approaches, including family programs, school-based programs from preschool all the way to teens, selective and universal programs, victim support, and community-based crime prevention. The evidence suggests there are 3 key principles of developmental prevention. The first principle, never too early, never too late, recognises that intervening as early as possible is ideal to provide the best opportunity for young people to thrive. However, humans are adaptive and are capable of change and recovery. So it's important that we're providing access to intervention, evidence-based intervention, from before birth to adulthood. The second principle is to target different levels of risk factors, recognising that violence is not attributable to a single cause. So in the pathways study that I've just been talking about, we see high rates of trauma, alcohol use, mental health, and comorbidity, yet these things don't cause violence in isolation. We need to understand how best to target resources to certain situations or people who present with combinations of risk factors to have the greatest impact. The third principle, the 70-25-5 rule, basically gets to the fact that while many people engage in some kind of problematic behaviour at some point, a large amount of violent crime is concentrated among a minority of serious and persistent offenders, the 5%. Therefore, a significant proportion of the spending to prevent violence may be best used on focusing on this 5% early on. I'm going to talk briefly now about some approaches that have effectiveness disrupting the developmental pathway to violence and intimate partner violence. So as we see in the information that I've presented today, and what we already know is that unstable home environments and child abuse is strongly related to developmental dysfunction, criminal behaviour, and violence in adulthood. The goal of community-level prevention is to break cycles of offending and abuse by buffering systems in place to best support children, young people, and families. A review of the international evidence on family-focused programs that aim to prevent child maltreatment, like home visitation programs and parenting programs, concludes that they're the most effective for improving young people's development and parental well-being. An example of an Australian program that is evidence-based is the Pathways to Prevention project, led by Professor Ross Hommel at Griffith University in partnership with Mission Australia. The program involved families, schools, and community services with the aim of preventing antisocial behaviour among young people. The research was conducted over 10 years and involved families living in a disadvantaged area of Brisbane. They found that even relatively low levels of family support was associated with improvements in children's classroom behaviour, the quality of their social relationships, and their capacity for self-regulation. Another way forward is to focus on the minority of young people who we know are at risk of being responsible for a significant amount of harm later on when they become adults. Now, this relates back to the third prevention principle, the 5%. Our own research at the AIC shows young people using violence in the home are more likely to perpetrate violence against partners later on in life. So last year we published a study showing that while young people using violence in the home make up only 7% of young people who come into contact with police, they are responsible for over 1/3 of police recorded domestic violence incidents in adulthood. So this tells us we know who many of these young people are early on, and we could be using this 5% rule to provide targeted intervention to interrupt this trajectory. So these are some examples of Australian programs targeting youth family violence and dating violence that have been shown to have benefits for young people and families. The first one is a community program called the Adolescent Family Violence Program. It's a Victorian program. And the second is the KIND program, run in South Australia in a youth justice setting. The third paper is a review of the evidence promoting a family-focused therapeutic response. These are some other examples of evidence-based programs for adults that target multiple risk factors related to trauma, alcohol and other drug problems, and mental health. I won't go through them all now, but we'll put the links to these in the chat. I will say that these studies show the promise of these approaches, but there are limitations such as small sample sizes, short follow-up periods, pilot designs, and it's unknown if what works elsewhere internationally will translate to the Australian context. So more research using randomised control trial designs with sufficient follow-up periods is needed here. So in summary, there are so many aspects to promoting a public health prevention approach to family violence. I have talked about just mostly a few evidence-based programs that prevent and address violence generally and intimate partner violence specifically, both in the community and in other settings. Any approach that aims to reduce violence against women, of course, must be integrated with, informed by, and implemented alongside approaches that aim for cultural change, to shift social attitudes away from men's acceptance of men's entitlement over women, and that see violence against women as a public health issue and a human rights issue that requires a coordinated response. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan. That was really, really interesting. So next up, we have Dr. Lee Eriksson. So Lee is a senior lecturer at the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University and is a member of the Griffith Criminology Institute. She's a family violence scholar whose research focuses on the development and pathways of lethal and non-lethal violent offending. She collaborates with leading national and international scholars on grants examining intimate partner femicide in Australia using interview data. Prior to her current role, she worked as a research analyst with the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention. So take it away, Lee.
Thank you, Hayley, for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation to present today. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking an interest in this very important event. As Hayley mentioned, my name is Lee Eriksson, and I am a member of the Griffith Criminology Institute at Griffith University. And the overarching question that I consider in this presentation is whether intimate partner homicides really do occur out of the blue. So what do I mean by out of the blue? Without warning signs, without indications that something was wrong, without any precursors. So this idea that a man might kill his intimate partner without having displayed any signs of antisocial conduct prior to the homicide. And the absolute vast majority of those of you in the audience would agree that intimate partner homicides do not occur out of the blue. But as a society, we are often provided with the out of the blue narrative by the media. Historically, when media reports on violence within the family, it has done so using episodic reporting and narratives of victim blaming. And this type of reporting is it's very common to see men who kill their intimate partners portrayed as these upstanding citizens in their communities without a history of violence, who are amazing hubbies, as per these articles here. But this type of portrayal signals to the reader that we could not possibly have predicted what happened. If he was such an upstanding citizen, if he was an amazing hubby, then how could we have known? So this type of media portrayal tells us that we couldn't have known because they killed out of the blue. But in my presentation today, I'm going to provide you with some empirical findings that go against that narrative. So the focus of this presentation is about what we know about the perpetrators of intimate partner homicide. And I've provided you with a quote here that I think is relevant. So a message that came out of the stakeholder workshops and interviews for the national plan stakeholder consultations that was recently finally released. One of the key points was that in order to be able to prevent intimate partner homicides, we need to understand the behavior of the perpetrators themselves. So one of the stakeholders said, working with perpetrators in the next national plan should be a priority. If we're serious about women's safety in this country, then we've got to focus on containing men's violence against women and children. So it has to be a priority. We have to know who we're dealing with. So we need to know who the perpetrators are. If we don't know what their characteristics are, then we cannot prevent and intervene before an intimate partner homicide occurs. And in my work, I examine the characteristics of intimate partner homicide perpetrators across the life course. And this brings me to my next quote, and you will recognize this from the previous presentation by Siobhan. This is a quote that sums up my view on intimate partner homicide and the possibility of prevention and intervention. So a key message that comes through in the developmental and life course criminology literature is that it's never too early and it's never too late to intervene with perpetrators. And ultimately, I see this as an evidence-based message of hope. So to understand intimate partner homicide, we need an evidence base, right? We are incredibly fortunate here in Australia to have such amazing scholars, including the presenters today, working in this field, thanks to whom we have a variety of data available. So we have, for example, official data, and Samantha Bricknell talked about the NHMP project, for example. We have the Pathways project that Siobhan just spoke about. We have national data from the Death Review Network. We have stakeholder consultations, interviews with victim survivors of attempted homicide, interviews with family members and friends of intimate partner homicide, and we also have perpetrator interviews. And the data that I will report on today come from perpetrator interviews. And all of these data sources are crucial to understanding intimate partner homicide. So I mentioned that my work examines the life course of perpetrators, and my research broadly examines various aspects of their childhood, adolescence, adulthood, including some of the issues that Siobhan spoke about in terms of trauma. I also examine attitudes and beliefs such as entitlement, for example, alcohol and drug use, offending history, relationship separation, etc. But in this presentation, I am going to focus on two aspects. I'm going to focus on the offending histories of perpetrators of intimate partner homicide, as well as problematic substance use of perpetrators. So the data that I'm presenting you with today comes from a large interview study with homicide offenders in Australia called the Australian Homicide Project. So this was an ARC funded project in which we collected data across Australia. We had 4 interviewers completing 302 interviews with men and women convicted of murder or manslaughter. And the interviews were conducted mainly in custodial facilities, but also in community corrections with perpetrators who were on parole. The interviews were conducted face-to-face, included obviously a series of questions, and each interview ran for approximately 2 hours. The aim of the project overall was to examine individual social and situational factors related to homicide, including developmental pathways and escalation of risk. And the current investigators on the project include myself, Professor Paul Mazerall, and Professor Richard Wortley. So in total, we interviewed 302 men and women convicted of murder or manslaughter in Australia. Our focus in today's presentation is on intimate partner homicide. So we obviously narrow down our sample down to the 81 cases in which a person had killed their current or former intimate partner. The next step in narrowing down our sample for today's presentation is to look at gender. So in this presentation, we're specifically interested in male perpetrated intimate partner homicide. So our sample consists of 68 men who had killed a current or former female intimate partner. I'm going to briefly review some selected findings. So first of all, starting off with offending histories. So this is perpetrators' self-reported offending history. So that includes, for example, the prevalence of different types of offending, also how old they were when they first engaged in offending behavior, as well as how versatile they were in their offending. So I'm going to run you through some slides to show you how common various forms of offending behavior were in our sample. So focusing first on theft and related offences, what we see is that around half of the men that we interviewed said that they had ever stolen something or taken something of significant value or bought or sold or held stolen goods. So that's 1 in 2 perpetrators with a history of theft and related offences. 1 in 3 perpetrators reported some form of property damage. That includes things like graffiti, purposeful damage to property, and also fire setting or attempted fire setting. So that's 1 in 3, 36%. In terms of drugs, and this is selling drugs, including marijuana, but also so-called hard drugs, 1 in 4 perpetrators, so 25%, reported that they had ever engaged in this type of behaviour, i.e. selling some form of drug. We, of course, asked about their violence in intimate relationships, and as many as 8 in 10 reported some violence, either in a past relationship or towards the partner that they killed. So that's 78%. And lastly, I always think it's interesting to look at the overall rate of offending. So we looked at whether the perpetrators had reported any form of offending. So that includes a number of offence categories. And as you can see, 9 out of 10 men, so 89%, reported some form of offending behaviour. And these are quite high numbers. And what this tells us is that past offending behaviour is actually quite common among men who kill their female intimate partners. So another aspect of offending histories that is of particular interest to developmental and life course criminologists is the age at which a person begins offending, and this is known as the the onset of offending or age of onset. So the earlier a person engages in offending behaviour, the more likely it is that that person will continue down a pathway of chronic high-frequency offending. So in our sample, we saw that 1/3, so 33% of the perpetrators had first offended before the age of 13, and that is often referred to as an early onset of offending. So before the age of 13, before they became teenagers, 1/3 had engaged in some form of offending behaviour. That's quite a high proportion in the sample who started their criminal career quite early on in life. Another area of interest is how versatile offenders are in their offending behaviour. So versatility is juxtaposed with specialisation. If you have an offender who only commits a certain type of offence, that offender would be known as a specialist offender. Someone who engages in a wide variety of offences would be known as a versatile offender. So what do we see in our sample? So we looked at 7 different types of offending behaviour listed on the slide there. So a person would score a 0 if the homicide was their first ever offence. They would score a 7 if they had engaged in all 7 offence categories prior to the homicide. So a 7 would be a highly versatile offender. So on average, this is an average here, on average we saw that perpetrators had engaged in 2.8 types of offences. Although it's not a very high number, it still does tell us that men who kill their intimate partners have a relatively versatile offending history. We now turn our attention to substance abuse, which is the other area of focus in this presentation. And here we are focusing on the perpetrator's self-reported problems with substances in the year leading up to the homicide, so in the 12 months leading up to the homicide. So to measure substance abuse, we used some established screening tools that are frequently used within clinical settings. I'm sure many of you have used these tools before. So we used the 10-item audit. And we use the established guidelines to divide the sample into 3 categories of problems. So no/low level problems, medium level problems, and high level problems. And there are established guidelines in terms of how to categorize that. We also use the 10-item DAST, which is the drug abuse screening test. And we again use the established guidelines to divide the sample into categories based on the level of problems. So we divided the sample into 5 categories, which is no problems, low level, moderate, substantial, and severe level problems. So starting first with alcohol. So we measured this using the audit. Of all men who had killed a female current or former intimate partner in our sample, a bit over half had no or low level problems with alcohol. Now, at face value, that might seem like a significant proportion who didn't have any problems, but it does leave us with about a quarter of the sample who had medium level problems and about 1/5 of our sample with high level problems. And if we compare those figures with general population data, we see that a much higher proportion of the men in our sample had alcohol problems compared with the general population. So we're looking at roughly twice the prevalence rate in our sample. So less than 23% of the general population fall into these 2 categories compared with 25 plus 21. So was that 46% of our sample. Now, if we look at the most problematic category, the high level problems, and compare that to the general population, we see an even more pronounced difference, with about 4 times the prevalence of high levels of problems in our sample of intimate partner homicide perpetrators compared with the general population. So next we looked at drug problems. So that's using the DAST screening tool. And again, we see that the majority, so 58%, did not display any problems with drugs. However, comparisons with general population data show that the prevalence rate of problems in our sample was actually much higher than what we see in the general population, approximately 3 times as prevalent. So less than 10% of the general population had moderate, substantial or severe levels of problems, compared to a much higher prevalence in our sample, 12 plus 17 plus 3, 32%. So what does all of this mean? What are the implications? So the question that I posed at the beginning of the presentation was whether intimate partner homicides really occur out of the blue. And based on the information I have provided you with today, I think the answer to that question is no. So interviews with men in our sample who'd killed an intimate partner revealed that offending behavior at some point in their life course was actually quite common, right? Recall that 9 out of 10 men stated that they had engaged in some form of offending. 9 out of 10 men, 89%. The interviews also revealed that men who had killed an intimate partner actually had quite high prevalence rates of substance use problems, much higher, at least, than the general population. And these findings challenge the perception that we often see portrayed in the media that intimate partner homicides occur out of the blue. Now, based on these findings, I want to emphasize the opportunities available for intervention across 2 areas in particular. First, assessment of risk of individuals who come into contact with the criminal justice system, and also the role of the primary health care sector in identifying and responding to domestic violence. So in terms of risk assessment, the findings in this study align with the national risk assessment principles developed by Andros, especially the second principle that stipulates the importance of perpetrators' actions and behaviours in terms of determining the level of risk to a woman. Now, despite Andros and many scholars noting the importance of a nationally consistent approach, states and territories do use different tools to measure risk. And many of them have been empirically evaluated, and that's great, but we do need to ensure consistency across jurisdictions. There are, of course, some consistencies, especially as it relates to some of the more common risk factors. A history of domestic and family violence is included as a risk factor in every single risk assessment available within this field, and so it should be. Misuse of drugs or excessive alcohol consumption, which is something we looked at specifically in this presentation, is also relatively common across risk assessments, though it is not included in every tool. What is interesting, though, is that other forms of offending behaviour, such as those examined in this presentation, like theft and drug offences, are often not included in risk assessments. And what our data show is that perpetrators are not your average Joes. Many of them do have extensive and sometimes versatile offending histories, sometimes with an early age of onset. But importantly, and one issue I do want to raise is that very few risk assessments in this field, especially in Australia, are focused on assessing risk of lethal violence. Most tools predict recidivism or re-assault. Some internationally developed tools, such as the danger assessment, do predict lethality, but the majority of our homegrown tools predict recidivism as opposed to lethal violence. So there's some really important work there that needs to be done in this field within an Australian context, and I know that there are scholars working on this and doing excellent work. In terms of primary healthcare, our data show that a relatively high proportion of intimate partner homicide offenders have problems with substance use. And so primary healthcare practitioners, such as GPs, are well placed to identify and assist people who drink excessively or perhaps develop problems as a result of drug use. And in these consultations about their problematic relationship with substances lies the opportunity to identify problematic behaviours across other areas of their lives, including domestic and family violence. There's been a lot of excellent work done in terms of overcoming the barriers to for disclosure and inquiry of domestic violence for women who attend primary care, such as during their visits to their GP or during prenatal or postnatal visits. But much less work has been done around primary healthcare providers' ability and readiness to identify perpetrators and to respond to potential disclosure of problematic behaviour. Research shows that victim survivors of domestic and family violence are actually quite good at self-assessing their risk, but perpetrators of violence are very likely to minimise and justify their behaviour. And this means that identification and assessment in primary healthcare settings actually requires careful and sensitive questioning and some application of clinical judgment as well. And to give an example, in approaching a conversation with a patient, there are two common pitfalls to avoid at the kind of opposite ends of the spectrum of responses, either being too oppositional in terms of condemning a patient's use of violence or being somehow inadvertently collusive in an effort to preserve that clinician-patient relationship. And it's not an easy task, and it requires evidence-based training. And I'm going to show you two examples of such training or such programs in a second. But I do want to mention and highlight that it's important to keep in mind the structural barriers that face primary healthcare providers. These last few years have been incredibly difficult, incredibly stressful for primary healthcare providers, and we can't simply expect GPs, for example, to take on extra responsibilities without considering and removing the structural barriers in place. Obviously, Time is one of those structural barriers. Another one is the support provided by clinics for staff to complete training, and the encouragement and promotion around training. So I mentioned I was going to discuss two programs currently available, two evidence-based programs. The first one is the ENGAGE project that was funded by the European Union. It aims to provide systematic training to frontline professionals, including GPs, in identifying perpetrators and referring them to services. And so they've developed a roadmap to assist the intervention with male service users who use violence in intimate relationships. And so the roadmap provides four distinct and clear steps, including how to identify the signs of DV, how to ask someone about their potential DV perpetration, how to recognise and encourage motivation for change, and also referral to coordinated multi-agency services. There are, of course, also local examples of programs aimed at enhancing primary healthcare providers with tools to address family violence. The Safer Families Centre, for example, led by Professors Hegarty, Brown and Humphreys, have developed something known as the Readiness Program. And part of that program focuses specifically on identifying patients who might be perpetrating domestic and family violence. So how do we start that conversation? How do we support behavioural change? Just last night, for example, the Safer Families Centre held an online workshop focusing on how GPs can engage with patients who use domestic violence. And that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lee. That was another really, really interesting and detailed presentation. So thank you very much. So in the run of presentations, we were supposed to be hearing from Associate Professor Kate Fitzgibbon at this point, but unfortunately one of her children are unwell, and so she won't be able to join us this morning, which is a real shame. However, I am going to step in at the last minute because Kate's presentation was going to focus on the relationship stage of the relationship, and in particular the role of bystanders in preventing intimate partner homicide trajectories, which I think is a really important topic for us to cover. So I've kind of done a bit of a quick and dirty presentation based on my own research, as well as the Pathways into Intimate Partner Homicide project that Siobhan has spoken to so far. And so I'm going to take you through some of the key findings on that. So previously, Siobhan has spoken to the Pathways into Intimate Partner Homicide project and what that kind of involved. So rather than starting at the beginning of the trajectory, like she did in terms of looking at early childhood experiences, I'm going to be focusing on the relationship stage. So the point at which the victims of homicide start their relationship with the offender. So this is kind of like, it can be a really broad period of time that we're looking at. So it could be as long as 30, 40 years, or it could be a very, very discrete period of time where we're looking at potentially weeks or months in the immediate lead up to the homicide event. So just to remind you of what the actual Pathways into Intimate Partner Homicide project involved, we did a detailed analysis of 200 cases of intimate partner homicide in Australia, where a current or former female intimate partner was murdered by their male partner. And we used coronial records, sentencing remarks, and the National Homicide Monitoring Program that Sam Bricknell spoke to in developing pathways to intimate partner homicide. So what we really wanted to understand was those key events and life milestones that led up to a lethal incident. And we started from the childhoods of the offender and kind of followed them throughout their life course as far as possible, really. So one of the things that we identified was that there wasn't just one pathway in terms of explaining the occurrence of intimate partner homicide. Instead, there were 3 different pathways that we were able to identify. And these were fixated threat, persistent and disorderly, and deterioration acute stresses. So while Siobhan and later Laura are talking more broadly about our sample, I'm going to be focusing on the role of bystanders at different points in the trajectories that we identified through this research, because they are quite different in terms of the visibility that bystanders had in terms of the violence within the relationship, but also opportunities for intervention. So as you can see from our pretty little Venn diagram, there were some overlapping cases where where a case may have exhibited traits associated with 2 or all of the trajectories that we identified. However, the vast majority of cases were easily classifiable within the 3 pathways, so fixated threat, persistent and disorderly, and deterioration acute stresses. Then we also had a couple of outliers and 18 unknown, where we were unable to classify because there was just a lack of information. So let's have a bit of a look at fixated threat in the first instance. So I'm going to take us back in terms of describing the whole pathway, because understanding the whole pathway is really, I think, important for understanding the role of, or potential role of, bystanders. So during the pre-relationship period, these offenders looked relatively normal and high functioning in many public facing domains of their lives. So these are the offenders who were employed, and they may have even been running their own businesses and employed in very high respected industries. They were also high functioning in other domains. So for example, some of them were involved in charity work or were viewed as upstanding members of society. While overall education levels within our sample were quite low, where education was present in terms of postgraduate qualifications and things like that, it was amongst this cohort. At time of the relationship starting with the victim, the relationship was characterised by significant power imbalances between the victim and the offender, favouring the offender. In many situations, this was because the victim was much younger than the offender. So, for example, there are a number of cases that we came across where it appeared that he was in his mid-20s and she was still in high school. So, 16, 17, 18 when the relationship started, and they married quickly after she turned 18. However, power imbalances may have been attributable to other factors such as financial dependence or social dependence. In some cases, they may have been first-generation migrants and come to Australia, and he may have understood and been able to speak English, but she was not. And so she was reliant on him in terms of navigating the new, social landscape that they were finding themselves in. Also, it may have been that he was the primary breadwinner and she was at home looking after shared children, and so on and so forth. However, a key stage in the trajectory for fixated threat offenders was a challenge in the relationship. So this may have been that she started to exert more independence from him in certain domains. So it may have been that she returned to the workforce, or she may have started to really succeed in her career. But in most situations, as Laura will speak to, it was primarily attributable to a separation. So the victim deciding that they no longer wanted to be in a relationship with the offender. And oftentimes this came after a significant period where the relationship was, intact. So we're looking at a median length of relationship of about 10 to 20 years for this cohort. So these are very significant and long-term relationships. However, during the relationship until that point of challenge, one of the key characteristics of the relationships was control. So not only was there a significant power imbalance between the victim and the offender, but there were also consistent and persistent patterns of coercive control within the relationship. And these were primarily non-physical, although sometimes physical forms of violence were also present. But it was commonly reported that behaviours perpetrated by the offender included social isolation and limitation of her ability to contact others, financial abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, spiritual abuse, and so on and so forth. So during the relationship, the power imbalances were very monetary, they were very structural, and they were also very emotional as well. So against this backdrop of a relationship characterised by persistent and ongoing patterns of coercive control, and the victim challenging this control through some kind of mechanism, what we saw was that in the post-separation period or post-challenge period was that there was an escalation in the controlling behaviours of the offender. And this is very reminiscent of, Jane Monckton-Smith's work, where she's looked at the 8-stage path to intimate partner homicide, where a challenge to the offender's authority over the victim resulted in an escalation in behaviour. So things like stalking and monitoring behaviours, as well as increase in verbal and emotional abuse. It may have been that their abuse started to encompass other members of the family or new partners that the victim may have had. And it was certainly a very concentrated period of time where the violence and abuse became very severe. However, oftentimes the escalation period did not coincide with a reconciliation. So a lot of the times the offender was trying to get the victim to capitulate, to basically amend their behaviours that they believed to be egregious. However, what we saw is that the victim more often than not stood firm and refused to acquiesce to their demands. And so against this backdrop, we see that these offenders had a change in thinking where they started to think about and plan to murder their partner as a means of re-exerting that control and punishing them. And in 1/3 of cases, what this looked like was that the offender started to make verbal threats to kill their partner. And these threats may have been made to the victim and their family members, but also to their own friends and family members. And I find that quite staggering that 1/3 of people, that 1/3 of offenders had threatened to kill their partners and then subsequently did. But there were only a couple of cases that we saw where someone actually took this information, these threats to kill, and took them seriously and tried to make a report. More often than not, they were dismissed as just, blowing off hot air or not being fully serious. At time of the lethal incident, these offenders entered the same space as the victim with a clear intent to kill. So they were very unlikely to be intoxicated. They had engaged in pre-planning. They oftentimes took in weapons with them to murder their partners, and they also engaged in activities to try and cover up what they had done after the event and prior to the event. So they were laying false alibis and things like that. So what does the role of bystanders look like in the fixated threat pathway? And I guess one of the biggest issues that we have is about visibility. So because these offenders were not engaging in physical forms of violence, it was very difficult, I guess, for some people in the lives of victims, survivors of victims and their partners to really recognise that domestic and family violence was even occurring within this relationship. However, I think that the lack of visibility of these offenders is also contributed to by the fact that they didn't look like a normal offender. I guess picking up on what Lee was talking about in terms of the narratives that the media spins for us when we talk about intimate partner homicide, and we talk about such a great bloke, came out of nowhere. It's because we had this idea in our minds about who an intimate partner homicide perpetrator is. And it's the bogeyman over there. It couldn't be someone possibly that I'm friends with, who I know. It has to be someone over there in that community. However, for 33% of the offenders that we had in our sample, these fixated threat guys, they were characterised by high levels of perceived functionality in many public-facing domains of their lives. They were employed, they were educated, they were engaging in community activities, they were running their own businesses. And this really challenges our own internal ideas about what a domestic and family violence offender and intimate partner homicide offender looks like. So when we think about visibility, we really have to challenge people's understanding of who an intimate partner homicide offender is and who is actually at risk. And I think that we also have to translate this not only in terms of bystander ability to recognise who an intimate partner homicide offender is, which means it could be anyone, even someone that you know and someone that you potentially like. But this translates to how we communicate with victim survivors who may be dealing with a fixated threat style offender. I've spoken to many, many women who, during the midst of their, I guess, relationships with abusive men, would often engage in help-seeking activities, which were very, very subtle and minor, even so far as to kind of just asking their friends, do you think that this behaviour in particular is normal? And their friends would often respond to them and say, oh, no, that's completely fine. You know, my partner did something like that. And this kind of, it's like a confirmation bias that these women then kind of hear, oh, okay, well, it's fine. So when he's telling me that he's fine and I'm the problem, and that just confirms for them the narrative that their abusers are spinning for them. So when we're thinking about challenging narratives about who an intimate partner homicide offender is, whenever we're thinking about empowering bystanders to not only have those conversations with victims, but also to be able to identify it, we have to diversify our representations of who these men are. So it can't just be the big, beefy, bulked up guy who's raising a fist at someone. It also has to be someone like from all different walks of life, because it could be anyone, as demonstrated through this fixated threat pathway. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on with the fixated threat offenders is that a third threatened to kill their partner and then subsequently did it. And very rare was it that the bystander who received this information did anything with it. And that just boggles my mind, that even in one situation, an offender said when he was golfing with his buddies a few months before the lethal incident, he said, "I'm going to kill her and I'm going to kill her with my golf club." And they all laughed and thought it was hilarious. And then a few months later, that's exactly what he did. So what is our responsibility as a community member in terms of protecting the safety of the women in our community who may be at risk? So even beyond identification, we need to be thinking about, well, how do we empower those bystanders to take that threat seriously, and how to empower them to actually make a report and have that report taken seriously? So I'll talk about specific examples of bystander programs that could be really helpful in designing such an intervention. So I'm only going to talk about the persistent and disorderly pathway now, just because I am running out of time. So the persistent and disorderly cohort accounted for about 40% of our overall sample, and they were the largest cohort within our sample. So during the pre-relationship period, these guys looked very, very different to the fixated threat offenders, in the sense that they had high levels of engagement with the criminal justice system, they had high levels of mental illness, they had high levels of AOD and trauma, and so they were highly visible to various different agencies. And it wasn't just that they were coming into contact with the criminal justice system for domestic and family violence related offences, but as Lee said, they were also coming into contact with the CJS for non-violent offences as well. So theft, drug offences, driving offences, and so on and so forth. At time of the relationship starting with the victim, these relationships were characterised by brevity. So they were oftentimes very, very brief. The longest was about 40 years, but like the median length was about 2 years. So relative to fixated threat and our other cohort, these were very, very brief relationships. So a key characteristic of these relationships was that they were characterised by high levels of physical and non-physical forms of violence, which often resulted in contact with the criminal justice system. Judges also problematically describe these relationships as toxic and on and off again, meaning that the victim and the offender would often separate and then reconcile and then separate and reconcile. However, despite this, I guess, relationship fluidity and also the high levels of physical violence, at time of the lethal incident occurring, the vast majority had reconciled, and so they were in the same space together as any other relationship, other couple kind of would be. So a key stage in the trajectory for some of these offenders was an escalation in their contact with the criminal justice system because of their use of violence against their partner. In particular, in the weeks and months leading up to the lethal incident, there was quite a number of offenders in the persistent and disorderly trajectory who were charged with a domestic and family violence offence and were also the subject of orders limiting their contact with the victim. So there might have been a protection order in place which said that they could not have any contact with the victim, or it could have been that they had restrictions on their behaviours, so they could not verbally abuse and threaten, harass, that they couldn't drink alcohol in the presence of the victim, and so on and so forth. However, because we know that these relationships were characterised by high levels of reconciliation, what we know is that even in the presence of an ongoing investigation, as well as protection orders and other orders, that oftentimes the victim and the offender had reconciled at time of the lethal violence occurring. However, because there was this understanding that there were now orders against them, which meant that they could not be together, what we saw for a number of couples in this sample was that they engaged in service avoidance, which meant that they tried to remain, I guess, out of sight, out of mind. They avoided contact with family members and friends. They avoided being seen in public together because they were trying to avoid being detected by the police, and so on and so forth, which meant that really the risk of lethal homicide occurring for these couples who did have these protection orders in place and were engaging in service avoidance increased significantly, because they were trying to spend more and more time alone together in the absence of any kind of, I guess, capable guardianship or bystander presence. So at time of the lethal violence, what we saw is that for a number of these cases, the victim and the offender were alone together. Sometimes they were even in really isolated and remote areas like the bush, and they were together as they would have been as any other couple. And then violence and abuse started, as it had done so previously on so many other occasions. However, the risk of lethal homicide increased significantly at this point in time because of the presence of situational risk factors that may not have been there previously. So things like extreme alcohol intoxication, the presence of a weapon, the absence of capable bystanders, and so on and so forth. And what a lot of the judges reflected on when they were reporting on these cases and making the sentencing decisions is that these incidents in and of themselves did not look dissimilar to previous patterns of violence within the relationship. It was just that this time he killed her. And so we see with a lot of these cases that afterwards he demonstrated high levels of surprise that he had actually killed his partner. And there was a number of these cases that were downgraded to manslaughter because of the lack of perceived mens rea. So what is the role of bystanders in the persistent and disorderly pathway? So in contrast to the fixated threat, in the fixated threat trajectory, these offenders were characterized by visibility, and the victims were characterized by visibility. There are a number of eyes that were on them at different points in time, not just family members and friends, but also service providers and things of that kind of nature. Even at time of the lethal incident, a significant proportion of incidents occurred in the presence of bystanders who may have been able to do something but did not or could not for various different reasons. And so when thinking about, well, what is the role of bystanders in this kind of case, I think the most obvious mechanism is that protection orders may not in and of themselves make women more safe. That in these situations where women choose, and I say choose very, very kind of, within inverted commas, because no one can really consent to be abused. In these situations, if they reconcile, what does safety planning look like in those circumstances? Simply telling the victim and the offender that they can no longer see each other or spend time together in the same space obviously was not an effective deterrence mechanism for many of these offenders and victims. So we all kind of talk about the need for a reform for protection order systems and things like that, but I think that this really does highlight the need for ongoing safety planning and review of protection orders in particular, in terms of looking at, well, if they've chosen to reconcile, chosen being inverted commas, to reconcile, what does safety look like in that context? Because if the presence of protection order simply makes women and offenders go further underground and try to avoid the presence of other people, then we're not supporting the safety of women, we're actually making them less safe. So I'm out of time, so I'm going to leave it there. But in terms of the presence of, in terms of different bystander empowerment, or I guess ally empowerment processes and what those kind of look like, I'll chuck a couple of different programs links in the chat so you can have a bit of a look at them. But a really good example to start with is one actually run by Griffith University called MATE, which is about trying to empower students and faculty to challenge negative behaviours when they come across it. All right. Okay, so skipping from being a presenter straight into the mode of actually introducing our next speaker and our final speaker for today. All right. So finally, our last presentation is from Laura Doherty. So Laura is a research analyst in the Violence Against Women and Children research program at the AIC. She was a co-investigator on the Pathways to Intimate Partner Homicide project and has contributed to research on homicide, deaths in custody, drug use in Australia, and sexual violence. Laura has also made significant contributions to the AIC statistical collections, including the National Homicide Monitoring Program and the National Deaths in Custody Program. So take it away, Laura.
Thank you, Hayley. I'm just hoping I'm unmuted now. It's telling me I am, but also that I'm not. But anyway, here we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura Doherty, a research analyst at the AIC and part of the Pathways to Intimate Partner Homicide project team, along with Hayley, Dr. Siobhan Lawler, Christy Franks, and Dr. Samantha Bricknell. I'm going to speak today about separation, which has consistently been identified as a risk factor for women's intimate partner homicide victimisation. However, our understanding of the overall context surrounding separation and its role in pathways to intimate partner homicide is currently lacking. This information is crucial for identifying high-risk matters where separation has occurred, as the vast majority of men whose relationships have ended will not go on to kill their partners. As such, this context surrounding separation was something that we considered through the analysis of the Pathways to Intimate Partner Homicide, or PIPA project data, which Siobhan and Hayley have both spoken to this morning. So, firstly, a little bit about the context of the cases involving separation that were included in our study. Of the 199 incidents examined, 3 in 10 involved a victim and offender who were separated at the time of the lethal violence, including one couple who were negotiating reconciliation. This is consistent with previous research, which has identified that recent separation is present in 20 to 57% of intimate partner homicides. Indeed, these separations were recent, with the lethal violence occurring within the first year of separation in 1 in every 2 cases involving a separated victim and offender. Here, I'd just like to quickly note that the trajectory or pathway of relationships involving an Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander victim or offender looked quite different to those involving non-Indigenous victims and offenders when looking at all of the cases examined as part of the PIPA project. Notably, Aboriginal and/or Torres Strait Islander victims and offenders were underrepresented in the sample of homicides occurring post-separation compared to the overall PIPA sample. As such, the presentation I'm about to dive into doesn't look at these relationships in their own right. What this presentation will do is refer to the subsample of 64 intimate partner homicide cases in which the victim and offender were separated at the time of the lethal incident. So in terms of the characteristics of these relationships, separation was more common among victims and offenders who were in long-term and committed relationships. Just over 3/4 of this sample had been married or were in a de facto relationship, and the relationships lasted for an average of 10 years prior to the homicide. Separation was also more common among those who had lived together on a full or a part-time basis, as was the case in 2/3 of this sample. This has previously been identified as a distinct risk factor for intimate partner homicide in the context of separation. Now, as mentioned earlier, not every man who has killed, whose relationship has ended will kill their partner. As such, it's crucial for us to identify the context surrounding separation that may increase the risk of intimate partner homicide at this time, beyond those initial relationship characteristics. So the PIPA project identified 4 key issues among this sample that might signify increased risk. And these are escalating patterns of violence and abuse post-separation, conflict about care arrangements for shared children, repartnering and concerns about love rivals, and financial disputes. So I'm now going to provide a bit more detail about each of these issues, beginning with escalating patterns of violence and abuse post-separation. During the post-separation period, 40 offenders, so 2/3 of this sample, perpetrated violence, including physical, emotional, sexual, and financial abuse, as well as coercive controlling behaviours. Of these, 2 in 3 cases involved the escalation of violence. Crucially, this violence was often detectable. 1 in 4 victims obtained a protection order at this time, and further victims disclosed the violence to family, friends, or colleagues. In one such case, the offender continued to perpetrate violence in the 2 years following separation, resulting in a protection order. He breached this order multiple times and on one occasion was incarcerated. However, he continued to threaten the victim and her family members during his time in prison, and again continued to do so once he was released. As such, the victim continually sought support from police, domestic violence services, and her family. Even after he killed the victim, the offender maintained that his violence had been justified, as he erroneously thought that the victim had been unfaithful to him at the end of their relationship, and also that she wasn't taking proper care of their children during the post-separation period. Again, both of these thoughts were false. So the violence perpetrated by the offender during this period was interpreted by our project team as the offender's attempts to re-exert control over the victim after she withdrew from him by initiating the separation, as was the case in 41 of the 44 cases in which the instigator of separation was known. So moving now on to conflict about care arrangements for shared children. Of the 31 cases in which the victim and offender had children together and were separated at the time of the lethal incident, 2 and 5 were preceded by conflicts about care arrangements for shared children. This may have involved formal or informal custody disputes, one parent limiting the other's access to shared children, handover issues, and in some cases resulting recovery orders, and disputes relating to the financial support of children. In many cases where the victim and offender were involved in disputes regarding the care of their children, the lethal violence was, at least in part, motivated by the offender's extreme anger at the victim for her perceived role in withholding or limiting his access to their children. This anger may have been exacerbated by the victim applying for a protection order against the offender due to his ongoing and persistent abuse of her, and also in some cases of their children. I'm now going to get into a case study that exemplifies the risk associated with conflict about care arrangements for shared children during the post-separation period. It's a little bit more detailed than some of the case studies that we provided throughout the day. So I just wanted to remind you that as with the entirety of today, the content may be upsetting or distressing. Help is available, and we've provided contact details for a number of services in the chat box on your right-hand side. So, in this case, the victim and offender had been married for a long time and had 4 children together. Their relationship was characterised by numerous separations and violence perpetrated by the offender. The victim had ended the relationship after a serious incident of intimate partner violence, and at this time she also obtained a protection order against the offender. After the separation, the victim and offender had an informal custody agreement that the victim would live in the family home with the children and the offender would spend 1 afternoon per week with them. After one of his afternoons with the children, the offender refused to return them to the victim until over a week later, when her application for a recovery order was approved. After they were returned to the victim, the children said that the offender had told them that he was planning on killing the victim. After this, the children understandably became particularly fearful of the offender. The victim was able to obtain an interim variation to the protection order, preventing the offender from contacting herself or now their children as well. The hearing for this variation was held 1 day prior to the lethal violence, during which the offender's contact with their children was suspended by the court. Now, the offender was upset by this outcome and needed to be physically restrained. At the time, he was heard threatening to kill the victim, quite loudly too, and the victim was indeed killed the next day after another family court proceeding. The sentencing judge for the homicide trial found that the offender was motivated by his extreme anger and that he held the victim responsible for the court prohibiting his access to their shared children. So this case study really exemplifies this increasing risk that's associated with ongoing child custody disputes, and also the visibility of this risk as well. So moving on to repartnering and concerns about love rivals. During the post-separation period, the victim was known to have repartnered in 18 of the 64 cases. In 6 of these, the offender suspected, again, often erroneously, that the victim had been unfaithful to him, even though her new relationship started after she separated from the offender. In over half of the cases involving the victim repartnering, the offender was described as being distressed, jealous, and angry as a result of this. In some separations, the offender's anger at the victim repartnering was exacerbated when he found out that her new relationship had become more serious, reducing the likelihood that they would reconcile. The victim establishing a new relationship or becoming more serious in her new relationship often signified that the offender had again lost control of the victim, resulting in him needing to re-establish this control, often through violent means. As such, the lethal incident often occurred shortly after the victim repartnered or her relationship became more serious. For example, in one case, the offender killed the victim on the night he found out that she became engaged to her new partner. In another case, the victim moved out of the home she shared with the offender and into a home with her new partner, and the offender killed her just 1 week after this occurred. In 7 cases, the offender had begun a new relationship following his separation from the victim. but there was no evidence that this contributed to any conflict between the victim and the offender. It did, however, contribute to conflict in the offender's new relationships in one case, as he told partners that he was still in love with the victim and wanted to reconcile with her. So, onto financial disputes. 2 in 5 cases in which the victim and offender were separated at the time of the lethal violence involved financial disputes. These disputes predominantly related to, the offender's concern that the victim had received or would receive a greater share of shared assets through legal proceedings. For example, after killing the victim, one offender told police that it was a shame that she couldn't accept a fair deal in relation to financial settlement, and that if she had, the conflict would have been solved in a different manner. That is, he wouldn't have killed her. Further conflicts involved what would be done with the family home, so whether who would live in it or whether or not they would sell it. The offender withdrawing financial support from the victim or withholding her access to her own or shared assets, and what would be done with shared businesses. So, having identified the context surrounding separation that may increase the risk of intimate partner homicide, it's important to ask how we use this research to prevent future homicides. First, these offenders were generally less visible to authorities throughout their relationship when compared to those who were not separated from their partners. For example, abuse was typically non-physical forms of violence, including emotional abuse, coercive control, and stalking behaviours. Offenders were typically employed and had a higher level of education. They also typically demonstrated lower levels of alcohol and other drug use, mental illness and physical illness or injury. And finally, they had less frequent or ongoing contact with the criminal justice system, or minimal, if any, contact for domestic violence related matters. For example, in one case that involved significant DV during the relationship, police contact occurred only once. In this instance, the offender was fined for threatening police with a firearm, but wasn't charged with any domestic violence related offences. So I suppose I just wanted to draw attention to the fact that these separation related cases and the offenders within them were typically fixated threat offenders, which Hayley spoke a little bit about earlier. So while they weren't particularly visible during their relationship, once the relationship ended and they began losing control over their partners, the behaviour of these offenders escalated, their attempts of control escalated, and ultimately this culminated in a homicide in a relatively short amount of time. So for example, 2 in 5 cases occurred within 3 months of separation. This escalation in behaviours increased the offender's visibility, but to prevent such homicides, we need to ensure that we're looking for the right risk factors and utilising the short window of time that we have to intervene following separation. Taken together, this highlights the need for, firstly, the detection of acute risk posed by offenders who have separated from their partners, using information that may not always be collected by traditional law enforcement responses, and also targeted and timely responses that can be implemented quickly to protect the safety of high-risk victims and their families. So, in some cases, detection of acute risk may be as straightforward as police attending a domestic violence incident between the victim and offender. But for other cases in which domestic violence is more out of sight and there is little, if any, contact with police, acute risk in the context of separation may be identified through the integration of or communication between civil and criminal law systems. Once offenders felt as though they were losing control of the victim, something I've spoken about quite extensively today, or of something else in their life that they blamed the victim for, such as loss of access to their children, we started to see them pop up in family law proceedings, in civil law proceedings associated with financial disputes, or as respondents named in protection orders, particularly first-time protection orders. So the case study I spoke to earlier was a really good example of this highly visible risk evident through family law proceedings. At these junctures, we need to be ensuring that police and/or domestic violence services are made aware of these situations and can conduct a risk assessment. Once high-risk situations have been identified, it's imperative that responses are implemented in a timely manner. These responses may involve ongoing enforcement of protection orders, safety planning with victims, including access to emergency housing and replacement of phones that the offender might be tracking, recalling here that in our study, men who killed their partner post-separation were more likely to have demonstrated stalking and monitoring behaviours, and also close surveillance of high-risk offenders. These intelligence-led approaches to identifying and responding to individuals who pose a high risk to the safety of the community have been used in other contexts, notably fixated threat assessment centres or FTACs, FTACs are designed to risk assess and case manage individuals who are fixated on public figures, such as politicians. They were first developed in the UK in 2006, and since then, almost all jurisdictions in Australia have also introduced their own. In both the UK and Australia, FTACs have effectively managed and de-escalated threats posed by fixated persons. So we will provide some references if we haven't already for FTACs in the chat. So what next? What the Pathways to Intimate Partner Homicide project data has demonstrated is that it's not separation in and of itself that is a risk factor for intimate partner homicide, but rather it's the separation-related conflicts, particularly relating to those relating to men's control over their former partners. But these conflicts don't just begin in the weeks, months, or years following separation. They're typically intertwined with the separation process itself, which may be ongoing and very protracted. This raises the question of, are we missing crucial points for intervention in the context of early or ongoing separation periods? And what about situations where the offender falsely believes that his partner is going to leave him? So the next study that we're going to be doing based on these data seeks to examine these situations, that is early and ongoing separation and perceived separation, and identify high-risk periods. For clarity, this might look like the victim and offender sleeping in separate bedrooms in the same household while negotiating the terms of their separation, which we did see quite a number of cases of in our study. In this way, separation might not actually be visible from outside of the relationship. What we are hoping to do with this study is identify where heightened periods of risks are in different groups of separation. So those who are clearly separated, who are in the process of separating, or where the offender falsely believes that the victim is going to separate from him, and those who've not separated, and how we might be able to use this knowledge to prevent intimate partner homicide. This may lead to the possibility of adapting risk assessments undertaken by police, domestic violence services, GPs, and similar to identify risks earlier in earlier separation periods. We have heard a bit about risk assessments today from Lee, which are often used by first responders when they have contact with a couple for domestic violence. There is certainly variation in what is included in risk assessments as they are, but many do include an item for whether the victim and offender have recently separated. What they typically don't include are items about whether the victim and offender are in the process of separating, or if one of the parties believes that they will soon separate. As noted throughout the presentation, these separation-related issues are really about control, and even the offender's belief that the victim is going to leave him might result in him attempting to re-exert control to prevent her from leaving. Adapted risk assessments may then allow for earlier interventions, such as safety planning with victims. But as mentioned, that is work that is still to come. So very, very briefly to wrap this up, the PIPA project identified 4 issues that might exacerbate the risk of intimate partner homicide associated with separation. These were escalating patterns of violence and abuse following separation, conflict about care arrangements for shared children, repartnering and concerns about love rivals, and financial disputes. Addressing these through intelligence-led approaches to identifying and responding to high-risk offenders may contribute to the prevention of such homicides during this post-separation period. We do hope to further this research by identifying periods of heightened risk among early and ongoing separation in our next study. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks, Laura. So I think that we've had a good overview of the life course trajectory in the presentations that we've just gone through. So Siobhan spoke about early childhood and adolescent experiences. Lee spoke about that adolescent, young adult kind of experiences through to adulthood. I talked about the relationship stage, and Laura's kind of finished it all off by looking at post-separation experiences. Thank you all for coming along and taking part. If anything does trigger you that we have spoken about today, if you scroll to the top of the Q&A, there's a whole bunch of resources there for you to reach out to. So if you do need support, support is available to you. And chuck the Australian Institute of Criminology a follow on Twitter or Facebook if you liked this seminar and you want to see what else we're doing over the next 12 months. We've got quite a lot on the agenda, and we hope to see you next time. So thank you all.